and part of what makes it unique, was a consequence of the very real barriers that those who were determined to protect Quebec culture had erected around the local institutions in Quebec. And so one of the things that's very interesting about Montreal downtown, it's a very walkable city, by the way. It has great restaurants and great bars and an unbelievably vibrant and safe and dynamic and interesting and creative street life. And the Montreal municipal authorities have done a lovely job of regenerating the old city, and the old port looks great. And Montreal is just a wonderful city. And because of the barriers to Anglophone dominance, that's the Canadian word for English dominance, let's say, the city never became homogenized in its corporate culture, and there were a tremendous proliferation of local businesses, and that they all had all the charm of local businesses. So they weren't chains of restaurants that were exactly the same as restaurants everywhere else. And so despite the fact that these barriers, linguistic barriers, made life in some ways more difficult for me personally as an English speaker, and despite the fact that I was somewhat irritated about the fact that the English had been routed out of Quebec in some fundamental way, and that the relationship between Alberta and Quebec was fractious, I loved Montreal. And every time I go back there, I'm thrilled to be there. And it really is a remarkably wonderful city. And so it begs the question, and how do you preserve the local while maintaining integration with the superordinate? And we have that problem in the world right now because the world's increasingly international in some real sense. There's a real utility in preserving local culture, and at the town level, at the province level, at the state level, at the national level, to preserve the autonomy and unique charms of each of those levels, but also to integrate the whole into a harmonious union. And all of us are struggling with that in a major way, and Canada struggles with that internally in a way, in some sense, that mirrors the situation in the entire world. And so that also complicates the political landscape. And so now, having said that, you also said that, so Quebec is also this very interesting contrast, because Montreal is a very free city. People pursue their own artistic interests. It has a very dynamic street life. People who live in Montreal live there. It isn't a city that feels like it's made up of people who moved there. And it's a very free culture. But Quebec also has this other element, which exists in paradoxical juxtaposition, which is in some ways more authoritarian in its proclivity than any other jurisdiction in Canada. I really saw that when I interacted with the government at the municipal level in Quebec, which was also often breeding all sorts of regulations that were just absolutely unreasonable and that was hard to negotiate with. And you said that Quebec, like France, had implemented extremely stringent COVID lockdowns, which is so much at odds with the spirit of a city like Montreal. And you also pointed out that that's bred a desire for, would you say a desire for the more libertarian kind of conservatism that, if I've got that right, that you represent and would like to make a case for?
Yeah, well, you have to understand that, as you rightly pointed out earlier as well, when we talked about the fact that the religious factor was melting down since the 60s, their social conservatism in Quebec is almost inexistent. Like, I'm the first openly gay leader of a conservative party in Canada's history, provincial or federal. And it's not a surprise that it's happening here in Quebec, because social conservatism is not part of the coalition of conservatives that we are. We have fiscal conservatives and more libertarian conservatives, but we're very few social conservatives.
Do you want to outline the difference between those so that everybody who's listening understands? So you said social, fiscal, and libertarian. It isn't obvious to people what the differentiation between the various forms of conservatism is, especially because the legacy media almost never talks about it. So,
yeah. Fiscal conservatism is people who want lower taxes, smaller state, so that's generally speaking how we define fiscal conservatives. Social conservatives are usually more towards moral issues. So it's more, gay rights or abortion or all those hot issues that we hear a lot, and the media talks about a lot about that normally when they talk about conservatives. And the third one is the libertarian. It's the individual rights, the respect for of civic rights, of individual freedoms. So that's more the aspect that the part that I'm in. But as a leader, you have to be representing all the wings within your party. But there's really three main kind of conservatives in Canada, and in Quebec we only have 2 out of the 3. That's what I wanted to point it out. And so it might be a little bit different than elsewhere, because even if it's a contradiction for many people, because they recall Quebec before pre-1960, which was the most religious society with a lot of kids for everyone, and we went from one side to the other completely, and now the religious practices here are much lower, and especially among the youth, and that's why our voters are even younger. So it's a complete shift as well. So the conservative movement in Quebec is different, and there's a nationalist element as well that's probably not existent elsewhere in Canada, of people who want to promote and protect French and our culture and our uniqueness. That is because that's also conserving, where we're from and our roots and our heritage.
So what is it that you're doing, or the Conservative Party is doing in Quebec specifically, apart from the reaction against the authoritarian clampdowns justified hypothetically by COVID? What do you think that you're doing that's working? Let me give you an example. One of the things I've found as I've toured around, and I suppose making a case at least for certain conservative virtues, is that people, particularly young people, seem to respond very well to the idea that there is an intrinsic meaning in life, and that intrinsic meaning is not to be found in the hedonistic, limitless freedom that's characteristic of an impulsive life, but more likely to be found, especially under conditions of duress, as a consequence of adopting the responsibilities of a mature life. And so that would be, existing to some degree in service for other people, especially the people that you love in your family, accepting responsibility for a marriage and a long-term relationship, and accepting responsibility, welcoming it for kids, and taking care of your extended family and serving your community. And this is all something that conservatives can really promote.